She killed my heat at minus 15 degrees Fahrenheit, so I legally froze 42 homes she controlled. The temperature outside was negative 15 degrees Fahrenheit the night Diane Holbrook sent the utility contractor to my property and had my gas line capped. No warning, no notice, just silence, then cold, then my daughter's lips turning blue. I called 911 because my 6-year-old, Maya, had stopped shivering, which any parent knows is worse than shivering. The dispatcher told me to get her to a hospital. Diane, meanwhile, was hosting a wine night 2 streets over. What I didn't know yet, what none of us 42 homeowners in Cedarwood Estates knew, was that the gas line Diane controlled ran under every single one of our properties. And I had just found the only lever that could bring her entire empire down. My name is Rachel Osei. I moved to Cedarwood Estates, a planned community outside Columbus, Ohio, 18 months before any of this happened, with my daughter Maya and my mother, Abina, who was recovering from hip surgery and needed a single-story home. We bought the house on Birchwood Lane because it had a walk-in shower on the ground floor, a yard big enough for Maya to chase fireflies, and a monthly HOA fee that was, at the time, a reasonable $220. I was a licensed electrician running my own small contracting firm. I worked hard. I paid my bills. I minded my business. Cedarwood Estates looked like a postcard when we arrived in late spring. Neighbors waved from driveways, kids rode bikes in cul-de-sacs, and someone had planted marigolds along the community mailbox cluster. I thought, this is the kind of place Maya deserves to grow up in. I was right about the place. I was wrong about the people running it. The HOA board was a 5-person body, but everyone in Cedarwood knew there was really only one person. Diane Holbrook, president, self-appointed community standards director, and, as I would later discover, silent co-owner of Pinnacle Property Solutions, the management company the HOA paid $4,800 a month to maintain common areas and utilities. Diane was 53, frosted blonde, and always wore a lanyard with her HOA badge even in her own front yard. She drove a white Range Rover with a custom plate that read CEDWD1, Cedarwood 1. I'm not making that up. I noticed it on my second day and thought it was a little much. I had no idea. My mother, Abina, met Diane first. She was sitting on our front step getting some morning sun when Diane parked the Range Rover and walked over with a clipboard. She handed my mother a laminated card titled Cedarwood Estates Community Standards, a welcome guide. It was 14 pages long. Abina thanked her politely and said she'd read it. Diane said, "The key points are flagged in yellow." There were 41 yellow flags. I read the whole thing that night after Maya went to bed. There were rules about grass height under 3.5 inches, approved exterior paint colors, a chart of 42 pre-approved shades, decorative item placement, no more than 2 non-seasonal items, visible from the street, and, buried on page 11, a clause about utility infrastructure maintenance, which gave the HOA board authority over shared service lines running through the community. I didn't think much of that clause then. I would later memorize it. The first sign that something was off came in July, 2 months after we moved in. I received a violation notice in the mail. Not hand-delivered, not emailed, but printed on HOA letterhead and mailed certified, informing me that my garden hose reel, stored on the side of the house, was visible from the street and constituted an unapproved exterior storage element. The fine was $75. I paid it the same day, moved the hose reel behind the gate, and filed it away as a quirk of the community. My neighbor across the street, Tom Waverly, a retired school principal who'd lived in Cedarwood for 11 years, told me over the fence, "They go after the new ones first. Show 'em you're easy to push around. They'll never stop." I thanked Tom but thought he was being dramatic. He wasn't. By August, I had received 2 more violation notices. One for a wind chime Maya had hung on the porch, unapproved auditory fixture, and one for my mother's medical supply delivery boxes left on the porch for 4 hours between arrival and when I got home to bring them inside. Visible clutter, the notice said. I appealed both violations at the August board meeting. The boardroom was the common area clubhouse, a beige room with folding chairs and a projector screen that only worked at certain angles. Diane sat at the center of a folding table with a gavel that looked like it was purchased specifically because she wanted a gavel. She wore her lanyard. She brought an agenda that was printed, laminated, and distributed to each attendee. When I stood up and explained that my mother had a medical condition requiring regular supply deliveries and that 4 hours of porch time did not constitute clutter, Diane listened with a smile that didn't move her eyes. Then she said, "Mrs. Osei, I understand your situation is complicated, but the community standards exist for everyone." She called for a vote. The board voted 4-1 to uphold the fine. The one dissenting vote was a man named Gerald Park, who looked at the table when Diane glanced at him. I paid the fines, but I started paying attention. At that same meeting, I noticed that Diane's own property, a corner lot on Willow Creek Drive, had a decorative stone fountain in the front yard that was clearly above the 2 non-seasonal item limit, and what appeared to be a freshly painted front door in a shade of terracotta that was not on the approved color chart. I took photos on my way out. Tom had told me during our fence conversation that 3 families had moved out of Cedarwood in the past 2 years specifically because of HOA pressure. The Nguyen's sold after Diane initiated a formal nuisance inquiry over their teenage son's basketball hoop. The Garcias left after an ongoing dispute about a wheelchair ramp they'd installed for Mrs. Garcia's mother, which Diane claimed violated structural modification rules even though the family had ADA documentation. I pulled up the HOA's public meeting minutes online. They went back 6 years. What I found was a pattern. Enforcement actions clustered almost entirely on properties owned by families who were newer, who had raised objections at meetings, or who, I noted with a cold clarity, were not white. Of the 22 formal violation escalations listed in those 6 years, 19 were against homeowners of color. Cedarwood was roughly 30% non-white. The math was not subtle. I didn't say anything yet. I was a single mother running a business, caring for an elderly parent, raising a kid. I didn't have time or energy for a crusade, but I kept the records. I saved every notice. I started photographing the common areas, the board members' properties, the contractor vehicles I saw coming and going. Something in me, maybe the electrician's brain, trained to trace circuits back to their source, told me this system had a flaw somewhere. I just hadn't found it yet. In September, I got a call from my business accountant, Priya, who had been helping me manage some cash flow issues from a slow summer quarter. She mentioned offhand that a property management company called Pinnacle Property Solutions had come up in a search she was doing for comparable HOA contracts in Central Ohio. "They're expensive for what they do," she said, "and there's something a little weird about their ownership structure." I asked her to dig a little deeper. She said she would. Meanwhile, Diane escalated. In October, the HOA sent a letter announcing a community infrastructure improvement project, the installation of new utility junction boxes along the shared gas line that ran under the back edges of all 42 residential lots in Cedarwood. The project would be managed by Pinnacle Property Solutions. The cost, $186,000, would be split among homeowners as a special assessment, $4,428 per household, due in full within 60 days. The room at the October board meeting was the fullest I'd ever seen it. Homeowners who hadn't come to a meeting in years showed up. People were angry. $4,428 was not small money for most families on fixed incomes, and the notice had given no itemized breakdown of costs, no competing bids, no engineering reports. Diane sat at her table with her gavel and her laminated agenda and smiled the smile that didn't reach her eyes. She explained that the infrastructure was aging, that the Ohio Utility Commission had issued informal guidance recommending upgrades, and that the board had evaluated multiple contractors before selecting Pinnacle. When a homeowner named Dennis Park, no relation to Gerald, asked to see the competing bids, Diane said the documents were proprietary to the bidding process and would not be shared publicly. She called for a vote. Passed 3-2. Gerald Park voted no. So did a newer board member, a young woman named Sophia Reyes, who looked shaken. I drove home that night knowing something was deeply wrong. When Priya called me the next morning, she had found it. Pinnacle Property Solutions, LLC was registered in Ohio under 2 managing members. A man named Howard Lech and, buried in a 2019 amendment to the Articles of Organization, Diane R. Holbrook. The HOA was paying $4,800 a month to a company that its own president secretly co-owned. And now that same company was getting a $186,000 contract funded by homeowner assessments that Diane had just voted to approve. I stared at Priya's email for a long time. Then I called Tom Waverly. He was quiet for a moment, then said, "I always suspected something, but I could never prove it." I told him what I'd found. He said, "Rachel, be careful. Diane doesn't just fight back. She preempts." I asked him what he meant. He said, "The Nguyen's didn't just leave. She made their lives so miserable they had no choice. And she did it legally, every step of the way." I said, "So will I." I didn't fire the first shot. Diane did, though I believe she thought I was too new and too distracted to notice. 2 weeks after the October meeting, I received a certified letter informing me that my electrical contracting business, Ose Electric LLC, was operating a commercial enterprise from a residential address in violation of HOA Bylaws Section 7.4, which prohibited business operations generating client traffic at residential properties. The letter cited 3 alleged incidents: a contractor's van parked in my driveway on a Saturday morning, a client arriving on a Wednesday afternoon, and a supply delivery address to my business name. I had done nothing illegal. I had no client traffic. The van was my own vehicle. The supply delivery was personal tools. And the client on Wednesday was my sister, Kofi, visiting from Akron, who happened to work in construction and had arrived in her work truck. The fine was $250 and came with a warning that continued violations could result in a formal commercial nuisance abatement action, which, per the bylaws, could trigger a lien on my property. A lien on my home for having a family member's truck in my driveway. I felt something shift inside me, the thing that tells you you're not just dealing with a bureaucratic inconvenience. You're dealing with a predator. I called an attorney named Marcus Webb, who specialized in HOA disputes and had been recommended to me by Priya's husband. Marcus listened to the whole story, the fines, the meeting pattern, the Pinnacle ownership, the assessment, without interrupting. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment and then said, "The conflict of interest you found is actionable, but building the case takes time. In the meantime, don't pay that commercial nuisance fine. Contest it. Force her to produce documentation." That was exactly what I did. I sent a formal written response to the HOA disputing the fine and requesting, per Ohio HOA statute, copies of all documentation supporting the alleged violations. Surveillance records, witness statements, date and time logs. The letter, drafted by Marcus, also included a polite but pointed request for the full financial records of the Pinnacle contract, citing Ohio Revised Code Section 5312.10, which gives homeowners the right to inspect association financial records. Diane's response came not as a letter but as a phone call. She called me on a Tuesday evening, and her voice had that carefully modulated warmth that very controlling people use when they want you to feel like they're being reasonable while they're actually tightening the screws. "Rachel, I just want to make sure we can resolve this before it becomes something bigger. I'd hate to see a misunderstanding create problems for your family. I said I'd received her letter and had submitted a formal response through my attorney. There was a pause. Then, "You've retained an attorney?" "Yes," I said. "Have a good evening, Diane." The next week, I received 3 more violation notices in a single envelope. My front walkway had a crack that constituted a maintenance hazard. My recycling bin had been left at the curb until 7 p.m. on collection day instead of being retrieved by 6 p.m. The bylaw said, promptly. And a small pumpkin Maya had placed on the porch step was, in early November, classified as an unseasonal decorative element because the HOA's official autumn decoration season ended October 31st. 3 fines totaling $375. Marcus told me to contest all 3 in writing and to start documenting every interaction with the HOA: date, time, content, tone. I already was. I had started a binder. It was getting thick. Tom came over for coffee one afternoon and looked at it with a mix of admiration and sadness. "You remind me of a parent I had once," he said. "Wouldn't let anything go. Wore them down by sheer documentation." I said I didn't want to wear anyone down. I wanted what was right. He nodded. Sometimes those are the same thing. At the November board meeting, I formally requested time on the agenda to present the financial records request. Diane allowed 5 minutes. I stood at the podium with my binder and calmly read the relevant Ohio statute, the specific records I was requesting, and the timeline for compliance. Diane listened with the non-smile. When I finished, she said the board would consult with its legal counsel and respond in writing. Gerald Park caught my eye as I sat down. He gave the smallest possible nod. After the meeting, Sophia Reyes, the younger board member who'd voted against the assessment, followed me to the parking lot. She was maybe 30, dark-haired, clearly nervous. She spoke quickly, quietly. "I found something in the Pinnacle files last month when I was reviewing the assessment documents. There's an invoice from Pinnacle to the HOA for a strategic planning retreat, $8,200. That happened in July, at a resort in Hilton Head. I asked Howard Lech about it. He said it was standard, but I checked. None of the board members were invited. It was just Diane." I looked at her. "Will you put that in writing?" She hesitated. "Not yet, but I wanted you to know." I told Marcus about Sophia. He said she could be valuable but not to push her. People who are scared and close to the source sometimes flinch at the last moment and disappear. I understood. I had seen it in my contracting work. The subcontractor who knows about the faulty wiring but won't go on record because he still needs jobs from the GC. I gave Sophia my card and told her to contact me when she was ready. I went home and added her information to my binder with a note, "Potential ally, handle carefully." December arrived. Christmas lights went up in Cedarwood, the pre-approved ones, of course, in the pre-approved colors within the pre-approved square footage of display. Maya was enchanted by the neighborhood decorations and made me walk her around every evening after dinner. My mother was improving from her surgery and had started doing gentle yoga in the living room. For a few weeks, the binder sat on my desk and I let myself just be a parent, a daughter, a neighbor. Felt almost normal. Almost. Because on December 12th, my contractor's van, the one I used for work, legitimately parked in my own driveway, was ticketed by a Cedarwood Estates HOA enforcement notice for commercial vehicle overnight parking, a restriction I had never seen in any document they'd sent me. I found the restriction on page 9 of a bylaw amendment dated November 29th, 17 days earlier. They had written a new rule specifically to target my vehicle. Marcus confirmed it was probably enforceable, but the speed of the amendment was telling. Diane was escalating, which meant she was scared. January came to Central Ohio like a door slamming. By the second week, The forecast was calling for a polar vortex event. Temperatures dropping to -12, -15, possibly lower with wind chill. My mother's physical therapist called to reschedule, citing road conditions. Maya's school announced a 4-day closure. I stocked the pantry, checked the furnace filter, and made sure our emergency space heaters were charged. I had no reason to think about the gas line. Not yet. The special assessment had been due December 31st. 40 of the 42 households in Cedarwood had paid. I had not. Marcus had filed a formal objection on my behalf, citing the conflict of interest and requesting an injunction pending investigation. One other homeowner, a man named Kwame Asante, a physician who had moved in 8 months before me, had also refused to pay after reading my objection letter, which Marcus had circulated with my permission to all HOA members. Kwame was quiet and methodical, the kind of man who made decisions slowly and then was immovable once he'd made them. He called me in January to say he'd hired his own attorney, a woman named Janet Hollis who had handled 3 HOA litigation cases in Franklin County. "Janet says what you found about Pinnacle is significant," he said. "She wants to coordinate with your attorney." I gave him Marcus's contact. 2 lines of resistance had just become one coordinated front. The HOA's response to our coordinated objection arrived on January 9th. A letter informing Kwame and me that our accounts were now formally delinquent and that, per bylaw section 14.3, delinquent homeowners could have access to shared community utilities managed by the association, suspended pending payment. I read it twice. Then I called Marcus. He said, "That clause is almost certainly unenforceable for primary residences. Ohio law protects basic utility access." I said, "Almost certainly?" He said, "Let me check the specific language on that gas line infrastructure." The gas line infrastructure, the junction boxes Pinnacle had installed, the shared service line running under all 42 lots. I had been so focused on the financial fraud that I hadn't looked carefully at what exactly Pinnacle had done to the physical infrastructure during the improvement project. I asked Marcus what he needed. He said a licensed engineer to look at the utility paperwork. I knew exactly who to call. My friend Deshaun Mercer was a licensed mechanical engineer who'd worked in utilities for 14 years before going independent. I'd done electrical work on 2 of his residential projects. He owed me a favor and, more importantly, he was curious. When I sent him the infrastructure documents from the Pinnacle project, he called me back in 2 hours. "Rachel," he said slowly, "this is not just junction boxes. They installed a central shutoff valve, a single point of control for the gas supply to every lot in Cedarwood." He paused. "And Pinnacle holds the access key." I felt the temperature in the room drop before I understood why. "She can shut off the gas," I said. It wasn't a question. Deshaun said, "Technically, the valve is on HOA-managed infrastructure. With the right or wrong interpretation of that bylaw clause, yes, she can." I asked if that was legal. He said, "Shutting off gas to a primary residence in Ohio? Almost certainly not. But legal and possible are 2 different things." I added his analysis to my binder. Then I called Tom. Tom said, "She wouldn't." But his voice wasn't sure. I had a conversation with Maya the next morning over pancakes. Not about any of this. She was 6. She didn't need to know about gas lines and HOA bylaws. She asked me if we could put a bird feeder in the backyard. I said yes, as long as it was in the backyard and not visible from the street. She gave me a look of 6-year-old wisdom and said, "Why does it matter if birds are visible from the street?" I said, "Good question." She said, "Maybe the people making the rules are scared of birds." I thought about that for a long time. On January 14th, Marcus received the HOA's legal response to our conflict of interest documentation. Their attorney, a firm called Whitfield and Grove, which I later learned had represented HOA boards in Central Ohio for 20 years and had a billing relationship with Pinnacle, argued that the Pinnacle co-ownership was disclosed in LLC registration documents that were publicly available, and that the board had voted to approve the contract in a properly noticed meeting, satisfying the duty of good faith. It was a clean, professional response. It didn't deny the facts. It just said the facts didn't matter. Marcus told me the response was expected. They're arguing process compliance over substance. It's the classic HOA defense. As long as they followed the procedural rules, the outcome is protected. He said our best path was to combine the financial misconduct argument with any additional violations we could document, and to build toward a formal removal petition under Ohio law, which required signatures from 30% of homeowners. That was 13 signatures from 42 households. "How many people do you think you can get?" he asked. I thought about all the yellow flags on my laminated welcome guide. "More than 13, I said. I started going door to door in the second week of January. I didn't go alone. Tom came with me, because in 11 years he'd accumulated the kind of neighbor credibility I hadn't had time to build yet. We knocked on every door in Cedarwood, explained what we'd found about Pinnacle, and asked people to read a one-page summary I'd prepared with Marcus's review. Of the 42 households, 33 opened the door. Of those, 26 took the summary. Of those, I received 11 callbacks by the end of the week. 11 callbacks led to 8 people willing to sign a petition, still 5 short of 13. The resistance wasn't disbelief. Most people believed me. It was fear. The same fear Tom had described. The understanding that Diane didn't just push back. She preempted. The Garcias wheelchair ramp. The Nguyen's basketball hoop. People had seen what happened when you stood up and didn't finish the job. They weren't ready to risk their homes on a fight that might not be won. On January 17th, a Thursday, I was meeting with Tom and Kwame at my kitchen table, reviewing our petition strategy, when my phone buzzed. It was a text from Sophia Reyes. "She's doing something with the Pinnacle contractor. I don't know what. Saw the truck at the utility access point near Birchwood. Thought you should know. Birchwood Lane. My street." I stood up and looked out my kitchen window. The Pinnacle truck was parked at the green utility access panel at the end of my block. A man in coveralls was working on it. My mother was in the living room. Maya was at school. I put my coat on and walked to the access panel. The man in coveralls glanced up. I asked what work was being performed. He said it was a maintenance check ordered by Pinnacle Property Solutions. I asked for the work order. He said he didn't have to provide that to a resident. I photographed the truck, the panel, and his company ID badge before he could turn away. His name was listed as J. Murrow, Pinnacle Field Services. I went inside and called Deshawn. I described what I'd seen. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Rachel, change your furnace filter and run the gas stove to make sure everything's working tonight. I'll explain why tomorrow." I did. The gas worked fine that Thursday night. Friday was cold but calm. Saturday, January 19th, the temperature dropped to -8 at noon and was forecast to hit -15 by midnight. I cooked dinner early, got my mother and Maya settled with extra blankets, and was reviewing documents in my home office when the furnace went quiet. I assumed it was cycling. It didn't come back. I checked the thermostat, set to 70. Actual temperature in the house, 68, dropping. I went to the furnace room. The pilot light was out. I tried to relight it manually. Nothing. No gas. I went to the kitchen and turned the stove burner. Nothing. I called the gas company, Columbia Gas of Ohio, and reported an outage. The automated system said there were no reported outages in my area. I gave them my address. A representative came on and said she was showing my service as customer side restricted. I asked what that meant. She said it meant the gas supply to my property had been shut off from a point after the utility meter, from infrastructure on my side, not the city's side. In other words, from the HOA's junction box. The temperature in my house was 61 degrees. Maya was under 2 blankets. My mother, post-surgery, could not tolerate sustained cold. Her medications affected her circulation. I called 911 and explained the situation. I called Tom, who said come over. I called Deshawn, who didn't answer. I called Marcus, who answered immediately, listened, and said 5 words. This is criminal. I'm calling now. I bundled my mother and Maya into the car and drove to Tom's house 2 streets over. The temperature gauge on my dashboard said -11. Tom's house was warm. His wife, Carol, made hot cocoa for Maya and tea for my mother without asking any questions, in the way that some people just know how to hold a crisis without making it louder. Tom sat with me at the kitchen table while I called every number I had. Maya asked if we were having a sleepover. I said yes. She cheered. My mother held my hand for a moment and didn't say anything. She didn't need to. Marcus called back at 10:47 p.m. He had reached the on-call attorney at the Ohio Attorney General's Consumer Protection Division and had also filed an emergency complaint with the Ohio Public Utilities Commission. I want you to understand, he said carefully, that what Diane has done tonight, shutting off gas to a primary residence in a polar vortex, is not a bylaw dispute. This is potentially criminal endangerment under Ohio Revised Code 2903.22. I asked what happened next. He said, tomorrow morning. A lot of things happen at once. Couldn't sleep. I lay on Tom's guest bed staring at the ceiling and running through what I knew. Diane had panicked. The petition, the financial records request, Sophia's information, the coordination with Kwame's attorney. It was closing in, and she'd done the worst possible thing a cornered person can do. She'd acted. She'd used the valve. She thought it would shake me loose, make me pay the assessment, make me stop. She'd miscalculated. Catastrophically. At 6 a.m. Sunday, I went back to my house to assess. The interior temperature had dropped to 44 degrees. My pipes were intact, just barely. The emergency space heaters had kept the utility room above freezing. I walked through every room and photographed it. The thermostat readings, the cold breath I could see in my own kitchen, Maya's empty bedroom with 2 stuffed animals left on the pillow. I added every photo to a time-stamped folder. Then I went back to Tom's and made breakfast for everyone. Marcus arrived at Tom's house at 9 a.m. with Janet Hollis, Kwame's attorney, and a woman I hadn't met before, a sharply dressed woman in her 50s named Dr. Patricia Wren, whom Marcus introduced as a public health expert who had agreed to provide an emergency affidavit documenting the medical risks of gas shutoff in extreme cold for households with elderly or pediatric residents. My mother, my daughter. Patricia shook my mother's hand very gently and said, in Chui, a single greeting. My mother looked at her in astonishment, then laughed. The first laugh I'd heard from her since Thursday. The legal strategy was multi-pronged. Marcus would file for an emergency temporary restraining order in Franklin County Court requiring the HOA to restore gas service immediately. Janet would simultaneously file a formal complaint with the Ohio HOA Regulatory Board citing financial misconduct and abuse of utility authority. And Marcus would also contact the Columbus Dispatch reporter who covered consumer protection, a woman named Evelyn Torres who had covered 2 HOA abuse stories in the past 3 years. Diane needs to know, Marcus said, that this is not a private fight anymore. Kwame arrived at Tom's house at 10 a.m. He was composed, methodical, and visibly angry in the way that quiet people get angry, like a pressure building in a closed system. He had already called Janet before she arrived and had also, on his own initiative, contacted 3 other Cedarwood homeowners who he believed were close to signing the petition. "The gas shutoff changes things," he said. "People were afraid before. Now they're angry." He was right. By noon, I had received 6 more calls from neighbors. We now had 14 signatures. One more than we needed. We had them to spare. The emergency TRO hearing was scheduled for Monday morning at 8 a.m. in Franklin County Common Pleas Court. Marcus prepared the filing Sunday afternoon at Tom's kitchen table on a laptop while Carol kept Maya occupied in the backyard with a bird identification book. Ironic, given our conversation about bird feeders. My mother slept in the guest room. Kwame and I reviewed the financial documents again and prepared a clean summary for the judge. For the first time since Thursday night, I felt something other than fear. I felt organized. I felt ready. Sunday evening, as the temperature outside hovered at -13, I got a text from a number I didn't recognize. It said, "This is Gerald Park. I am the HOA board member who has voted against Diane at the last 4 meetings. I heard what happened on Saturday. I need to talk to you." I showed it to Marcus. He said call back immediately. I did. Gerald's voice was older than I expected, tentative but steady. He said, "I have copies of internal board communications going back 2 years. Diane has been directing enforcement actions through personal messages, not official channels, to avoid creating a paper trail. I've kept everything. I didn't know what to do with it. I think I do now." Gerald met us at Tom's house at 8 that evening. He was a small man, late 60s, with the kind of careful politeness that comes from long practice of navigating someone else's dominance. He brought a manila envelope. Inside were 47 printed emails and texts between Diane and the other board members. Messages directing them to target specific properties, coordinate timing of violation notices, and avoid documenting certain decisions at official meetings. One message, dated October 3rd, read, "Don't put anything about the Osei situation in the minutes. I'll handle it directly." The date was 2 weeks before my commercial vehicle notice arrived. Marcus looked at the emails for a long time without speaking. Then he said, "This is a pattern of intentional targeting. Combined with the utility shutoff, combined with the Pinnacle conflict, Gerald, I need you to understand that these documents could result in criminal charges. Are you prepared for that?" Gerald folded his hands on the table. "I'm 71 years old," he said. "I've been watching her bully this neighborhood for 6 years. The night she put that woman's child in the cold, I stopped being afraid of her." He pushed the envelope forward. "Do whatever you need to do." By Sunday night, we had the TRO filing ready, Gerald's documents scanned and incorporated, Patricia's affidavit attached, and 14 petition signatures. Marcus called the AG's office again and updated the on-call attorney with Gerald's materials. The on-call attorney's voice shifted in a way that told me something significant had registered. She said they would have someone from the criminal enforcement section review the utility shutoff by Monday morning. I went to bed at 1 a.m. in Tom's guest room and actually slept. Monday morning, January 21st. I dressed in the dark, kissed Maya on the forehead while she slept, and told Tom I'd be back by noon. Marcus picked me up at 7:30. On the drive to the courthouse, he told me the Columbus Dispatch had confirmed they were sending Evelyn Torres to cover the hearing. He said it as a neutral fact. I understood it as a warning shot across Diane's bow. One she didn't know was coming. We parked and walked into the courthouse. My hands were steady. I had been an electrician for 15 years. I had learned to work on live circuits without flinching. This was the same. The Franklin County Common Pleas courtroom was a wood-paneled room that smelled of old paper and central heating. The judge was the Honorable Catherine Marsh, a woman in her 60s with reading glasses on a chain and the particular stillness of someone who has heard every version of every argument and is now focused entirely on facts. Diane's attorney, a man from Whitfield and Grove named Christopher Vale, was at the opposing table in a suit that probably cost more than my monthly mortgage. Diane herself sat beside him in a charcoal blazer, the lanyard absent for once, her expression carefully composed. She hadn't expected me to have a courtroom. I could see it in the fractional adjustment of her jaw when she looked at our table and saw Marcus, Janet, Patricia, and me. She had expected a frightened homeowner who would pay the fine and make it go away. She had not accounted for 14 petition signatures, a retired board member with 47 emails, a public health expert with a signed affidavit, and a Franklin County judge who had been briefed by an AG's office attorney at 7 a.m. that morning. Judge Marsh read the filings for 12 minutes in complete silence. When she looked up, she addressed Christopher Vail. "Counselor, can your client explain the operational basis for shutting off gas service to a primary residential property during a state-declared cold weather emergency?" Vail spoke smoothly about HOA Utility Management Authority and the bylaw clause. Judge Marsh listened. Then she said, "The motion for temporary restraining order is granted. Gas service is to be restored to the property at 14 Birchwood Lane within 4 hours. I'm also ordering a temporary freeze on all HOA Utility Management Authority pending a full hearing, which I'm scheduling for February 10th. She set down the papers and looked at Diane. "Ma'am, in 30 years on this bench, I have not seen a homeowners association shut off heat to a family in -15-degree weather. I hope your attorney is explaining to you the distinction between authority and judgment." The courtroom had a particular quality of stillness when the judge finished speaking. Vail wrote something on his legal pad. Diane's expression didn't change, but the skin around her eyes tightened in a way that told me she was calculating. She was not someone who crumbled. She was someone who pivoted. I had won the morning. I hadn't won the war. Marcus drove me back to Tom's house to pick up Maya and my mother. On the way, he told me that the TRO was a significant win, but that Diane would likely appeal it or look for procedural grounds to delay compliance. He also said the February 10th full hearing was our real target. That was when the broader misconduct case would be aired. "The dispatch piece will run this week," he said. "That changes the terrain. Diane is going to feel that." I asked if I should be worried about retaliation. He said, "Yes, but it's harder to retaliate against someone the public is watching." I went home that afternoon. Once Columbia Gas confirmed the line had been reopened. The house was cold, 44 degrees still, but the furnace lit and by evening it was 68. I made soup. Maya built a Lego city on the living room floor. My mother sat in her recliner and watched a nature documentary about African elephants. It looked like a normal evening. It was the eye of a storm. Evelyn Torres from the Dispatch called me Tuesday morning. She was direct, professional, and listened without interrupting. My favorite quality in any person. I told her everything I was legally able to share, which was most of it. Marcus had cleared the scope of the conversation. She asked good questions about the timeline, about my daughter, about my mother's medical situation, about the Pinnacle conflict of interest. I could hear her typing. She said the story would run Thursday. Gerald Park called Wednesday to let me know that Diane had called him twice since Monday's hearing. He hadn't picked up. "She wants to know what I gave you," he said. "I'm not answering." I thanked him. He said, "Thank me by finishing this." Sophia Reyes texted me the same day. She's been in the office pulling files all day. I think she knows about the Hilton Head receipt. Sophia still wouldn't put anything in writing, but she was a canary in the coal mine and the canary was nervous. Tom told me over the fence Thursday morning that he'd heard Diane had spoken to 2 other board members at a private dinner the night before, the 2 who had reliably voted with her. He didn't know what was said, but he noted that when he'd passed one of them, a man named Phil Garrett, in the community parking lot that morning, Phil had avoided eye contact. "Phil hasn't avoided eye contact with anyone in 11 years, Tom said. "Something's shifting." The Columbus Dispatch story ran Thursday evening, online first, then in print Friday morning. Evelyn Torres had done her work well. The headline read, HOA President Shut Off Family's Heat in Polar Vortex. Documents show undisclosed financial ties to contractor. It ran 1,400 words and included a photo of my empty, frost-rimed kitchen taken the Sunday after the shutoff. It didn't use Maya's name, I'd asked, but it mentioned a 6-year-old daughter. It mentioned my elderly mother. It mentioned the -15 temperature. It mentioned the Pinnacle co-ownership and the $186,000 assessment. By Friday noon, the story had 4,200 social media shares. By Friday evening, 11,000. The local TV stations picked it up Friday night. By Saturday morning, a Columbus Morning News segment was running footage of Cedarwood Estates' entrance sign, the tasteful one with the decorative ironwork Diane had approved, with my house on Birchwood Lane visible in the background. 3 national HOA watchdog organizations had shared the article. A legal advocacy nonprofit in Cincinnati had called Marcus to offer pro bono support. The territory had shifted. Diane issued a statement through Whitfield and Grove. The HOA was reviewing all relevant facts and was committed to the safety and well-being of all Cedarwood Estates residents. It said the utility action had been taken in accordance with HOA bylaws and that the association welcomed the opportunity to present its position at the February 10th hearing. It was a professionally drafted statement that said nothing. The comments section under the Dispatch article was less restrained. It had 847 comments by Saturday afternoon. I did not read them. The week after the Dispatch story was a strange kind of siege. Support came from unexpected directions. A casserole left on my porch by a neighbor I'd never met on the far end of Cedarwood. A card from the school where Maya went with a handwritten note from her teacher, "We're thinking of you." A call from a local city council member who said she was monitoring the situation. Pressure came from unexpected directions, too. On Monday, January 28th, I received a notice from the HOA, now going through Whitfield and Grove, informing me that my binder of HOA documents, including materials distributed at meetings, constituted misappropriation of proprietary association records, and that I was being put on notice of potential legal action. Marcus called it a nuisance filing designed to intimidate. He sent a response within the hour. But it told me something. Diane was still fighting on every front she could find. The more interesting development was inside the HOA board itself. Sophia Reyes called me Friday evening, and for the first time her voice was not nervous. It was flat, resolved. "I'm going to put it in writing," she said. "All of it. The Hilton Head receipt, the communications I've seen, the way she managed the assessment vote. I've been talking to Janet Hollis, and she told me I have whistleblower protections under Ohio law." I said, "Sophia, I need you to understand that when you do this, it will be public." She said, "I understand. My grandmother lost her house to an HOA lien in Arizona. I know what this is." I said, "Thank you." She said, "Don't thank me. Just win." Sophia's written statement arrived at Marcus and Janet's offices the following Monday. It was 7 pages. It documented 3 specific instances of financial misconduct she had personally witnessed, including the Hilton Head invoice, a pattern of Diane voting on matters where she had an undisclosed financial interest, and a November board meeting where Diane had directed 2 members to change their votes after the formal session ended, what amounted to vote manipulation outside of proper procedure. Sophia had also kept personal notes with dates and times. She was methodical. She was furious. She was exactly what we needed. The February 10th hearing was still 10 days away, but the case was building pressure like a sealed system. The AG's Criminal Enforcement Section had officially opened an investigation. Marcus had confirmed this, and a detective had called me to schedule an interview. Kwame's attorney Janet had filed a separate action against the HOA board in Franklin County for the assessment, which was now being reviewed by a forensic accountant the AG's office had appointed. Diane's world was narrowing from multiple directions, and she knew it. The question was how she'd respond. She responded on February 2nd, a Saturday. I came outside to find that my front walkway, the one with the crack she'd cited in October, had been marked with orange spray paint and a sign reading, HOA maintenance notice. Hazardous condition, do not use. The sign was plastic, professional, and zip-tied to a stake driven into my front lawn. It looked official. It was designed to look official. My neighbors who hadn't read the dispatch story might have assumed my property was condemned. Maya saw it from the window and asked if our house was broken. I called Marcus. He told me to photograph it and leave it. She's trying to get a reaction, he said. Don't give her one. I photographed it from 4 angles. Then I went inside and helped Maya finish her Lego city. Tom came over an hour later, saw the sign, and said something under his breath that I won't repeat. Then he went home and came back with a bag of sidewalk salt, which he spread around the sign's perimeter with great ceremony, as if performing a ritual. There, he said, maintained. I laughed for the first time in 2 weeks. On February 4th, something happened that I had not anticipated. The HOA's general counsel, not Whitfield and Grove, but a separate attorney the board had apparently hired specifically for this matter, sent a letter to Marcus proposing a mediated settlement. Diane was offering to rescind the special assessment, dismiss all outstanding violation notices against my property, and make a formal apology to the Osei family in exchange for dropping the financial misconduct complaint and removing the formal petition. Marcus called to discuss it. I said, no. He said, I expected that. Just wanted to confirm. I said, she doesn't get to buy her way out of what she did to my family, and the other 41 households still need their money back. The settlement offer told me 2 things. Diane was scared, and she still thought this was about me. She hadn't understood yet, or couldn't accept, that it was about all of Cedarwood. Marcus wrote back declining the settlement and noting that the petition, the AG investigation, and the board member affidavits were not matters within my personal authority to dismiss. The tent had gotten bigger than she'd planned for. On February 6th, for days before the hearing, I got a call from a number I didn't recognize. A woman's voice. Low, precise, unfriendly. She said her name was Vivian Lech, the wife of Howard Lech, Diane's co-owner in Pinnacle. She said that her husband had had nothing to do with the decision to shut off my gas, that he had in fact argued against it when Diane proposed it in December, and that he was prepared to provide a sworn statement to that effect. She paused. I said, Ms. Lech, is your husband willing to cooperate with the AG's investigation? Another pause. He's considering it, she said. He's been considering it since the Dispatch article. He has a family too. I said, tell him to call Marcus Webb. She hung up without saying goodbye. I sat with that for a moment. Then I added H. Lech, potential cooperating witness, to my binder. The binder was now 4 inches thick. Marcus had made copies. Janet had copies. The AG's office had copies. The Franklin County Courthouse had been provided filed versions of everything. The evidence existed in too many places to be threatened or erased. That was intentional. That was something Deshawn had told me in the beginning. When you're dealing with someone who controls infrastructure, you distribute everything. You make sure the loss of any single point doesn't collapse the whole system. He was talking about electrical grids. He was right about everything. On February 7th, 3 days before the hearing, I received a call from Phil Garrett. The board member Tom had noticed avoiding eye contact. He asked to meet in person. We met at a coffee shop on the Route 40 corridor, neutral territory. Phil was a heavy-set man in his late 50s who looked like he'd spent the past 2 weeks not sleeping. He ordered coffee and stirred it without drinking it. He said, "I want you to know that I didn't know about the Pinnacle connection. I voted with Diane because she's persuasive and because I've always trusted her judgment. I didn't know the gas shutoff was going to happen. I want the record to be clear about that." I looked at him. "Will you say that in writing?" He nodded. "I'll say it to the judge." 2 board members, Gerald and Sophia, had already provided written statements. Now a third, Phil, was willing to testify. Of the 5-member board, only Diane and 1 remaining member, a man named Arthur Coles, who had not responded to any contact, were unaccounted for. The math was significant. A majority of the board was prepared to contradict Diane's account of events. For an organization whose authority rested on the appearance of unanimous leadership, that was a structural collapse. Marcus called me the evening of February 8th, 2 days before the hearing, with news I hadn't expected. The Columbus Fire Department's arson and utility unit, which had been looped in by the AG's office after the gas shutoff, had conducted an inspection of the Pinnacle installed valve system and found that the central shutoff mechanism was not properly registered with the utility company or disclosed to Columbia Gas. In other words, Pinnacle had installed a gas control mechanism without required permits or utility notifications. The fire code violations alone were a separate legal exposure for Pinnacle, and for Diane as co-owner. Howard Lech had called Marcus. He was cooperating. He provided records showing that Diane had personally directed the valve installation, had instructed him to keep it off the standard permit filings, and had, in his account, specifically discussed in December the possibility of using it as leverage against homeowners who refused to pay the assessment. He had saved the text messages. Marcus's voice when he told me this was the voice of a man who had just watched a case go from strong to overwhelming. He said, "Rachel, I need you to understand. This is not just an HOA case anymore." I understood. I went into Maya's room and sat on the edge of her bed while she slept. The nightlight made the room a soft gold. She was curled around a stuffed elephant named Peanut. My mother was sleeping too, in her room at the end of the hall, with the nightlight she kept for her middle-of-the-night bathroom trips. Both of them were warm. Both of them were safe. For a moment, that was the only thing that mattered. Then I went back to my desk and kept working. The morning of February 9th, 1 day before the hearing, Evelyn Torres published a follow-up article in the Dispatch. It reported that the AG's office had opened a criminal investigation, that multiple board members had provided contradictory accounts, and that Howard Lech had retained separate counsel. She had not yet disclosed Lech's cooperation. Marcus asked her to hold that, but the new article moved the story from HOA dispute to potential criminal matter. The national media pickup intensified. By afternoon, the New York Times real estate desk had called Marcus for a comment. He gave one. Measured. Accurate. Devastating. That evening, my phone rang again. Sophia Reyes. Her voice was shaking slightly. Not with fear this time, but with something she was trying to hold back. She said, "Diane called a special board meeting tonight at the clubhouse. Emergency session. I'm going. I don't know what she's planning, but I'll let you know." I asked her to be careful. She said, "I've been careful for 2 years. I'm done being careful." She hung up. I sat in my kitchen and waited. 40 minutes later, she texted 2 words. She resigned. I read the text 4 times. Then I called Marcus. Marcus was quiet for a moment after I told him. Then he said, "The resignation doesn't stop the hearing. It doesn't stop the AG investigation. It doesn't restore the assessment money or address the fire code violations. But it does mean the board can no longer coordinate a defense around her." He paused. "How do you feel?" I said, like someone who's been running towards something and just realized they're still running. He said, "That's right. Don't stop yet." I called Tom at 9 p.m. He picked up on the first ring. When I told him Diane had resigned, he was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, 11 years. His voice was different from usual, thinner, like a piece of tension that had been held too long finally releasing. 11 years, and I never thought I'd see it. I said, "It's not over." He said, "I know, but it started. That's something, Rachel. That's something." Diane's resignation hit Cedarwood Estates like a stone dropped in still water. Everyone felt the ripple before they understood the source. By the next morning, February 10th, the day of the hearing, I had received 19 text messages from neighbors I'd never personally spoken to, all some variation of, "Is it true?" and "What happens now?" I answered each one briefly and honestly. The hearing proceeds, the investigation continues, and the fight isn't finished. I arrived at the Franklin County Courthouse at 7:45 a.m. Marcus was already there with 2 associates and a rolling cart of documents. Janet was with Kwame on the opposite side of the marble lobby. We nodded at each other, the nod of people who have been in a long cold together and have arrived at the warm part. Evelyn Torres was in the gallery with a notebook. 3 other journalists I didn't recognize were also in the gallery. The courtroom was no longer a private space. It was a stage. Christopher Vail from Whitfield and Grove arrived at 8:05 a.m. Alone, without Diane. Vail was a professional, and professionals don't show what they feel, but he had the very specific posture of a lawyer who has had a terrible 2 weeks and expects today to continue the trend. He sat up at the table with the methodical efficiency of someone managing what can be managed. I watched him and thought, "You took her case when she was powerful. Now you're in this courtroom alone because she ran." Judge Marsh entered at 8:30 exactly. She had read the new filings, Diane's resignation, the Lech cooperation, the fire code violations. She acknowledged them from the bench without expression. She then looked at Vail and said, "Your client has resigned from the HOA board. Does she intend to continue defending the personal liability claims?" Vail said his client was evaluating her position. Judge Marsh said, "She has until this afternoon." Then she turned to Marcus and said, "Proceed." Marcus proceeded for 1 hour and 40 minutes. He laid out the case with the patience and precision of someone who has spent weeks organizing 4 inches of documentation into something a judge can follow in 90 minutes. The pinnacle conflict of interest, the secret co-ownership, the unpermitted valve installation, the gas shutoff during a declared weather emergency, the targeting pattern documented in Gerald's emails, the vote manipulation Sophia had witnessed, the Hilton Head invoice, Howard Lech's cooperation, the assessment, $186,000 collected from 40 homeowners based on a contract approved by someone who financially benefited from it. When Marcus finished, Vail had 45 minutes. He spent 30 of them arguing procedural points, the public availability of the LLC filing, the bylaw authority on utilities, the proper notice given for the assessment vote. For the last 15 minutes, he shifted. "My client deeply regrets the utility incident and acknowledges it caused distress to the Osei family. She acted on legal advice that the bylaw clause authorized the action. She accepts that the court has a different interpretation." It was the closest thing to a concession I'd ever heard from a Whitfield and Grove attorney. Judge Marsh did not appear moved. Judge Marsh asked 3 questions. The first, what is the current status of the special assessment funds collected from homeowners? Marcus said they were held in the HOA operating account and subject to the ongoing freeze order. The second, has the unpermitted valve been rendered inoperable pending the utility investigation? Marcus confirmed it had, as of February 8th. The third, and she asked this one looking at Vail, Is your client prepared to make any admission of financial impropriety in the Pinnacle matter? Vale said she was not. Judge Marsh nodded once, as if confirming a prior assessment. Then she called a recess. During the recess, I sat in the marble hallway on a bench with Kwame. He had brought coffee in a thermos and poured me a cup without asking. We didn't talk much. I looked at the light coming through the tall courthouse windows and thought about the night in -15 when Maya stopped shivering. I thought about Peanut the stuffed elephant. I thought about my mother's hand squeezing mine. I thought about Tom spreading sidewalk salt around Diane's intimidation sign with the dignity of a ritual. Kwame said, "Whatever the judge decides, you changed this neighborhood." I said, "I just want my assessment money back." He smiled. That too. When court reconvened, Judge Marsh issued her findings. The temporary restraining order on HOA Utility Authority was converted to a permanent injunction. The HOA could not manage, restrict, or alter gas or electrical service to any residential property without written consent from the affected homeowner and notice to the utility company. The assessment was frozen pending a forensic audit to be completed within 60 days. The board was ordered to provide full financial records to the forensic auditor and to the AG's office. Individual board members, with the exception of those who had provided cooperative affidavits, Gerald, Sophia, Phil, were subject to personal financial liability for the assessment pending the audit findings. Diane Holbrook, by name, was referred to the AG's Criminal Division for review of potential charges under Ohio Revised Code 2903.22, criminal endangerment, and Ohio securities fraud statutes related to the undisclosed financial interest. Judge Marsh set down her glasses. She said, "This court has broad sympathy for the role that homeowners associations play in maintaining community standards. It has no sympathy for the weaponization of that role. The evidence in this case documents a sustained, deliberate, and financially motivated abuse of authority that endangered lives and defrauded homeowners. The legal system will address this systematically. The community will need to address it structurally. I wish Cedarwood Estates well in both efforts." She stood. Court was adjourned. I thought it was over. I was wrong. Diane Holbrook did not accept defeat the way someone who has lost accepts defeat. She accepted it the way someone who has never lost in her adult life accepts it, by refusing to believe it had happened and looking for a door that was still open. The resignation was real. The hearing was over. What I didn't know was that she had been working a parallel strategy since the night she left the emergency board meeting, and I had 4 days before I found out what it was. February 14th, Valentine's Day, was a Thursday. Maya made construction paper hearts for her class and one for my mother, who put it on the refrigerator next to a photo of herself as a young woman in Accra. I dropped Maya at school, came home, made coffee, sat down at my desk, and opened my email to find a message from my business bank informing me that my business checking account, the account where I kept the operating funds for Osei Electric LLC, had been flagged for review pending a complaint lodged by a third party alleging fraudulent business operations from a residential address. I read the email 3 times. Then I called my bank. They confirmed. A formal written complaint had been submitted by what they called a concerned third party. They couldn't say who, alleging that my business was operating illegally from a home address and that the account might be associated with fraudulent activity. The complaint had triggered a standard compliance review. My account was not frozen yet, but it would be if the review determined probable cause. My business operated on that account. My payroll ran through that account. 3 employees depended on that account. Diane had found another door. I called Marcus immediately. He was calm, but his voice had that specific tightness that means he's thinking hard and fast. He said, "She can't access your bank directly, but a written complaint to a financial institution is a public act." She submitted her name. I want a copy of that complaint. He called the bank's compliance department. Took 3 hours, but by afternoon he had a copy of the complaint. It was signed, Diane R. Holbrook, in her capacity as former HOA Community Standards Director. It alleged that I was running an unregistered commercial operation from a residential property and that my business license was fraudulent. The complaint was factually wrong on every point. My business license was registered in Franklin County and in good standing. The residential address on my license was my office mailing address, not my home, a distinction that is standard practice for sole proprietor contractors. Marcus drafted a response to the bank with documentation within 4 hours. The account review was resolved in my favor within 48 hours. But the days it took, the phone calls, the anxiety, the explaining to my employees that payroll was temporarily uncertain, that cost me something. That was the point. She knew she couldn't win. She was trying to make winning expensive. She's going to keep doing this, Marcus told me when the bank situation was resolved. Different vectors. Whatever she can access, professional licenses, permits, insurance, references. Anything associated with your name that a third-party complaint can disrupt. He paused. We need to go on offense on the personal liability. The February 10th ruling had noted personal liability for board members, but a civil action specifically naming Diane for damages, including the gas shutoff, the financial retaliation, the business interference, was a separate step Marcus had been holding in reserve. She just used her last goodwill moment, he said. I'm filing Monday. The civil complaint was filed February 18th. It named Diane Holbrook personally, Pinnacle Property Solutions LLC, and Howard Lech as defendants. It sought compensatory damages for the gas shutoff, emergency hotel costs, medical evaluation for my mother, disruption to my business, and punitive damages for the pattern of retaliatory targeting. Marcus sent a press release to Evelyn Torres at the same time the filing was submitted. Evelyn published a brief update the same afternoon. The tent had gotten bigger again. What I didn't expect was that Howard Lech's attorney would contact Marcus within 24 hours of the filing. Lech wanted to settle separately and quickly. His cooperation with the AG was full, his exposure on the fire code violations was real, and a civil judgment against Pinnacle would, as his attorney explained, be existential for the business. Lech offered to pay my compensatory damages in full and provide additional documentation against Diane in exchange for a release of claims against Pinnacle. Marcus and I discussed it. I accepted. It wasn't about Lech. It was always about Diane. While the civil case built its own momentum, something else was happening in Cedarwood Estates that I only learned about secondhand through Sophia, who was now fully and openly in our corner. The remaining HOA board, Gerald, Sophia, Phil, and a newly elected interim member, a retired civil engineer named Francis Wu who the community had rallied around, had taken stock of the situation and made a decision. They hired an independent auditor and a new management company. They voted unanimously to suspend all outstanding violation fines issued during Diane's tenure pending review. They also voted to formally notify all 40 homeowners that the special assessment was suspended and that refunds would be processed pending the forensic audit. Frances Wu called me to let me know. She had a voice like someone who has dealt with engineers and contractors her whole career, direct, no wasted syllables. She said, "The board has authorized me to reach out to you personally and apologize for what this association did to your family. Not as a legal statement, not as a settlement communication, as a human apology from neighbors to a neighbor." I said, "Thank you." She said, "We want you to know that the community standards exist to protect people, not to hurt them. We lost our way. We intend to find it again." She meant it. I believed her. Diane was quiet for 8 days after the civil complaint was filed. No contact, no filings, no third-party complaints. 8 days. I kept working, kept parenting, kept checking my binder. On February 26th, she surfaced again, this time not through legal channels but through social media. Someone, later confirmed to be Diane herself through a private account, posted in a Cedarwood Estates neighborhood Facebook group claiming that I had fabricated the gas shutoff incident, that my house had functioning heat the entire time, and that the legal case against her was a coordinated shakedown by outside agitators. The post cited no evidence. It was shared 17 times before the group moderator, a woman who had seen Maya shivering in Tom's kitchen that Sunday morning, deleted it. I almost ignored it. Marcus told me to document it. I did, a screenshot time-stamped, added to the binder. Then I called Deshawn, who had the engineering report on the valve. He had already photographed the valve in its closed position on the night of January 19th. He'd driven past my house that night and noticed the Pinnacle truck. He had the timestamp. He had the photos. He forwarded everything to Marcus with a note that said simply, "She's lying. Here's the proof." We sent the documentation to the Facebook group moderator and to Evelyn Torres as background. The false narrative went nowhere. The AG's criminal division contacted me for a formal interview on February 28th. The detective was a woman named Sandra Kolb, mid-40s, with the kind of economy of motion that experienced investigators develop. She didn't waste movement or words. She asked me to walk her through every date, every interaction, every document. The interview lasted 4 hours. I had brought the full binder. She photographed every page. Near the end, she asked, "When you found the Pinnacle conflict of interest last October, did you consider going directly to law enforcement at that point?" I said, "I wanted to try the legal channels first. I didn't want to escalate if I didn't have to." She nodded. "You escalated at exactly the right moment." I said, "She escalated." I responded. Sandra Kolb almost smiled. "That's a useful distinction," she said. On March 3rd, I received what I can only describe as the most surreal document of the entire ordeal. A formal HOA violation notice from Diane Holbrook, mailed from her personal address, citing my front walkway crack as a continued unresolved maintenance hazard. She was no longer on the board. She had no authority to issue violation notices. She had typed it on what appeared to be her personal computer, using a font that approximated the HOA letterhead. She had mailed it to me, my address, first class, with a stamp. I photographed it and sent it to Marcus. He added it to the civil complaint as an exhibit. "Harassment following litigation," he noted. "Excellent." Sandra Kolb called me March 5th. Her voice was different, not warmer but more direct in a way that signals movement. She said, "Ms. Osei, I'm going to tell you that the criminal division has completed its preliminary review and has recommended to the AG that formal charges be pursued. I can't tell you the specific charges yet, but I want you to know that your documentation was central to the recommendation." She paused. "You kept very good records." I said, "I'm an electrician. We trace things back to the source." She said, "That's exactly what we did." I told Tom that evening. He sat in my kitchen with a cup of coffee and listened, and when I finished he said, "I want to ask you something, Rachel. Do you feel like you won?" I thought about it honestly. I said, "I feel like the truth won. I feel like my daughter is warm and my mother is safe and the forensic auditor is going to find what he finds and the AG is going to charge what he charges. And none of that required me to be anything other than what I am." Tom nodded slowly. "That's better than winning," he said. "Most people don't get to say that." March arrived. The forensic audit was underway. Cedarwood Estates was doing the quiet work of rebuilding, new management contract, suspended fines, refund notifications going out. Maya had a new friend from 2 streets over, a girl named Lucy, who rode bikes in the cul-de-sac on weekends. My mother's hip had healed enough that she was walking without the cane indoors. Priya's husband sent a bottle of wine with a note that said, "You earned this. Drink it slowly." I put it in the cabinet for the right moment. Diane had hired new personal attorneys, a firm out of Cincinnati, not Whitfield and Grove. The Whitfield and Grove relationship had, Marcus told me, been quietly terminated after the February 10th hearing. Something about a billing dispute he heard. I suspected it was about something more fundamental. Firms like Whitfield and Grove depend on winning, and they can read when the current has turned. Diane's Cincinnati attorneys filed a series of motions challenging the civil complaint on procedural grounds, none of which Marcus found alarming, all of which he answered in writing with meticulous patience. On March 12, the Columbus Dispatch published a third article by Evelyn Torres. It reported that Diane Holbrook had been formally served with a criminal complaint by the Ohio Attorney General charging her with criminal endangerment under Ohio Revised Code 2903.22, telecommunications harassment, for the fake violation notice and one count of theft in office, a charge typically reserved for public officials but applicable to certain fiduciary roles including HOA board presidents under Ohio law. The theft charge related to the $186,000 assessment funneled to a company she secretly co-owned. The article ran on the front page of the online edition. It had 8,900 shares by noon. I didn't celebrate. I made breakfast, packed Maya's lunch, drove her to school, came home, checked my email, answered 3 calls from neighbors, and then, for a few minutes, I sat in my kitchen and looked out the window at the backyard where Maya wanted to put a bird feeder. The ground was still frozen, but March sunlight was starting to find the angles that meant spring was coming. I thought about the night in -15 when I'd bundled my daughter and my mother into a car and driven to Tom's house, not knowing if my pipes had burst, not knowing if I had a home to go back to. I thought about how Diane had assumed that doing that to me would end something. Instead, it had started everything. March moved the way March does in Ohio, reluctantly, cold refusing to give entirely, sunlight arriving in parcels. My life had reorganized itself around the case in ways I was only starting to notice now that the loudest moments had passed. I was behind on 2 contracts for Osei Electric. My accountant Priya had covered for me through January and February, but by March I owed her a real conversation. Marcus's fees were significant, offset partly by the settlement from Lech, but still real. I had been a crisis for months. Now I needed to be a business again. Kwame had handled the situation differently from me. More methodically, less visibly. While I'd been the public face of the fight, he'd been building a parallel documentation case with Janet Hollis that was now formally attached to the AG action. He called me one afternoon to check in, and at the end of the conversation he said something I've thought about since. "You know, Rachel, Diane targeted you because she thought you were alone. A new homeowner, single parent, no history in the community, no allies. She miscalculated how wrong she was about all of that." I said, "She made me collect the allies." He said, "Yes, that's always the mistake." The forensic audit report came back March 17th. The auditor, a man named Paul Estman from a Columbus firm, had reviewed 6 years of HOA financial records. He found 4 distinct categories of misallocation. Pinnacle invoices that were inflated by an estimated 34% above market rate for comparable services. The $186,000 assessment structured without required competitive bidding in violation of the HOA's own bylaws. The $8,200 Hilton Head strategic retreat expense charged to the HOA without board authorization. And this one stopped me cold. A pattern of small maintenance charges between $200 and $800 each, billed through Pinnacle and approved by Diane going back to 2019. Totaling an additional $67,300 in unexplained expenses. 6 years of quiet theft. When Marcus sent me the audit summary, I sat with it for a long time. $67,300, plus the assessment, plus 4 years of inflated monthly contracts. The total figure Estman estimated was between $280,000 and $310,000 in financial benefit to Diane and Lech through the Pinnacle relationship. It had been hidden in plain sight in quarterly board meetings with laminated agendas, in utility invoices with professional letterhead, in a community of families who trusted that the person holding the gavel was using it in their interest. She had sat in that beige room with her gavel and her lanyard for 6 years and quietly stolen from the neighborhood she claimed to protect. Diane's Cincinnati attorneys filed a motion to dismiss the civil complaint on March 19th, arguing that board members acting within their official capacity could not be held personally liable for association decisions. Marcus had anticipated this argument. His response was 43 pages and methodically dismantled every case they cited, incorporating the AG's criminal complaint as evidence that the actions in question were explicitly outside the scope of lawful board authority. The motion was scheduled to be heard April 7th. Judge Marsh was presiding. Marcus said, "I'm not worried about April 7th. I was not worried about April 7th either. I was worried, in the quiet way that mothers worry about things they can't entirely control, about what this whole experience was doing to Maya. She was 6. She hadn't understood most of what had happened, but she had understood the cold night. She had understood sleeping at Tom's house. She had understood that her stuffed animals were in a house that was being fixed. She told her teacher that bad people tried to turn off our heat, and the teacher had called me to ask if I wanted to connect Maya with the school counselor. I said yes. We had 3 sessions. Maya told the counselor that the bad people were wrong and that her mama fixed it. The counselor told me Maya was doing fine. Kids are more resilient when they have one parent who holds their ground. I held mine. On March 22nd, Gerald Park called me with news that surprised me. Arthur Coles, the 5th board member, the one who had never responded to any contact, had shown up at a board meeting for the first time since Diane's resignation. He sat quietly through the entire meeting. At the end, he asked to make a statement. He said he had voted with Diane on several matters where he'd had private doubts, and that he wanted to be on the record as supporting the current board's reform efforts. He did not apologize. He did not take responsibility, but he showed up. Gerald said, "Sometimes showing up is the beginning of something, even if it's late." I thought about that. I thought about Howard Lech's wife calling me, about Phil Garrett meeting me at the coffee shop, about Sophia's grandmother who lost her house in Arizona. People come to truth by different roads. Diane applied for a court modification of her civil complaint obligations on March 25th, arguing financial hardship. She submitted a financial disclosure showing that her personal assets were largely tied up in her home and that the potential judgment in the civil case would require her to sell. The disclosure was a strategic document, not a personal one. Her attorneys were laying groundwork to argue against punitive damages. Marcus said, "This is standard. They're trying to limit the ceiling on what the jury can award." I noted, privately, that the home she was describing as her primary asset was on Willow Creek Drive in Cedarwood Estates, the corner lot with the unapproved terracotta door and the fountain that exceeded the decoration limit. She had spent 6 years enforcing the rules on everyone else. She had never applied them to herself. April arrived with rain and crocuses. Maya planted a packet of mixed wildflower seeds in the backyard, and we put a simple wooden bird feeder on a pole near the fence. No permit required. No elastion. Just seeds and a wooden box and a 6-year-old girl who thought the people making the rules were scared of birds. Within a week, we had chickadees. My mother photographed them from the kitchen window on her phone and sent the pictures to her sister in Accra. "American birds," she captioned them. Very small, very brave. The civil case hearing on April 7th went as Marcus predicted. Judge Marsh denied the motion to dismiss in 40 minutes, incorporating the criminal complaint and the audit findings as establishing a prima facie case for personal liability. She set a trial date for October. The civil case would proceed. In the meantime, the AG's criminal case was moving on its own schedule, preliminary hearing set for May 14th. Diane had been arraigned in late March, had pleaded not guilty to all 3 charges, and had been released on her own recognizance. Marcus told me the criminal process would take longer than the civil. Possibly much longer, he said. But the civil case settles most often before trial. October is a placeholder more than a destination. On April 10th, 3 days after the civil hearing, I got a call from a number I didn't recognize, a Cincinnati area code. I almost didn't pick up. When I did, a woman's voice said, "Ms. Osei, my name is Renata. I'm Diane Holbrook's daughter." I said nothing, waiting. Renata was clearly composed but not entirely steady. She said, "I want to be very clear that I'm not calling on my mother's behalf or with her knowledge. I'm calling because I've read everything and I've talked to my family and I wanted to know if you and your family are okay." I said, "We're okay." She said, "I'm sorry. I can't say more than that. But I wanted you to know I'm sorry." She hung up. I sat with the phone in my hand for a long time. I didn't tell Marcus about Renata's call. It wasn't relevant to the case. It was just human. A daughter calling to say what her mother wouldn't. I put it somewhere separate from the binder, in the part of my mind that holds the things too complicated to categorize. I didn't feel sorry for Diane, but I felt something adjacent to sorry for the world she had made around herself. The world where her own daughter was calling strangers to apologize on her behalf because she never would. That world is its own punishment. I kept working. In mid-April, the new Cedarwood board made 2 announcements. First, refund checks for the special assessment would be mailed to all 40 paying homeowners by April 30th. Second, the HOA was formally adopting a homeowner rights amendment to its bylaws, which included protections for medical accommodations, minority-owned businesses, operating legally from residential addresses, and a requirement that all vendor contracts above $5,000 require competitive bidding and conflict of interest disclosure. Francis Wu sent me a draft of the amendment and asked if I had any suggested language. I did. She incorporated all of it. The assessment refund check arrived on April 28th. For $1,428. I held it for a moment. It wasn't about the money. It had never been about the money. But there was something concrete and real about a check in my hand that represented what 40 families should never have paid. I deposited it into Maya's college fund. It seemed right. May arrived. The spring was full and green in a way that Ohio does well when it tries. The neighborhood marigolds were back at the mailbox cluster, and someone had added zinnias. The community felt different, quieter in a way that was calm rather than suppressed. People waved at each other across driveways again. Tom reported that the April board meeting had been attended by fewer people than the crisis meetings but more people than the pre-crisis normal. Healthy, he said. Engaged without being furious. That's the goal. The criminal preliminary hearing on May 14th produced no dramatic revelations but advanced the case significantly. The AG's prosecutor presented the full evidence package including the Lech cooperation, the Gerald emails, the Deschamps engineering report, and the utility company records showing the unpermitted valve installation. Diane's criminal defense attorneys, different from the Cincinnati civil team, argued that the charges were overstated and that the utility action had been taken on legal advice. The judge set a trial date for January of the following year. The criminal case would be long. That was the nature of it. But it would happen. Marcus and I spoke at length about the civil case in late May. He had received informal signals from Diane's civil attorneys that they were open to settlement discussion. A trial in October carried risk, Not that we would lose, but that a jury might be conservative on punitive damages. A settlement, on the other hand, could be structured to include conditions beyond money. A formal public admission, a permanent injunction on Diane ever serving in an HOA leadership capacity in Ohio, and a contribution to a community fund for Cedarwood residents who had suffered financial harm from the prior management regime. "What matters most to you in a settlement?" Marcus asked. I said, "The admission and the injunction. The money is secondary." He said, "I'll tell them that." He said it the way lawyers say things when they know what they're doing. June came. The chickadees had been joined by a pair of house finches at Maya's bird feeder, and she had started keeping a notebook of bird sightings with hand-drawn illustrations. My mother had progressed enough in her recovery that she was doing a gentle yoga class at a community center twice a week. Osei Electric had landed 2 significant commercial contracts in April and May that put the business back on solid footing. I had paid back the favor to Deshaun by doing the electrical work on his new garage project at cost. Life had resumed its shape. I went to Tom's fence one morning in mid-June, the way neighbors do, not for any reason, just because it was a nice morning and Tom was out with his coffee. He told me he'd seen a new family moving into the house the Gwynns had left 2 years ago, a young couple with a toddler and a dog. I went over and introduced myself, he said. Brought them the HOA welcome guide, the new one. He shook his head with a gentle smile. It's 3 pages now. Single-sided. I laughed. He said, "You know what the new version says at the top?" I said I didn't. He said, "It says, Cedarwood Estates is a community. These are guidelines to help us live together respectfully. If you have concerns, the board is here to listen." 12 words of welcome. Diane's version had 0 words of welcome. 41 yellow flags. I said, "That's the whole story." He nodded. "That's the whole story." I allowed myself, in June, something I had not allowed since January. The feeling of peace. Not victory, peace. There's a difference. Victory is about the other person losing. Peace is about being able to sit in your own kitchen on a Tuesday morning with good coffee and the sound of birds outside and the knowledge that your child is safe and your mother is healing and the world, at least in your small corner of it, has been made slightly more fair than it was before. I sat in that kitchen for 20 minutes on a Tuesday in June. I had earned those 20 minutes. I took them. July arrived with the particular heaviness of a central Ohio summer. The air thick and still in the mornings before it turned punishing by noon. Marcus called on July 9th with news I hadn't expected. Diane's civil attorneys had broken off settlement discussions. No explanation given. The October trial date was confirmed. Marcus had spoken to his contact at the AG's office, who told him that the criminal defense team had also made a strategic shift. New lead counsel. More aggressive posture. "Something changed," Marcus said. "I don't know what yet." I said, "She found something." He said, "Or someone convinced her she had a chance." I found out on July 14th what had changed. A woman named Carol Denning, who had been Diane's personal assistant for 4 years before leaving in 2022, had contacted Diane's new criminal attorney and offered to provide testimony on Diane's behalf. What Carol claimed, what was apparently going to be Diane's new defense, was that Howard Lech had been the operational decision-maker for Pinnacle and that Diane had been a passive investor with no day-to-day authority. As for the gas shutoff, Carol alleged that she had personally heard Marcus Webb, my attorney, advising me to provoke the HOA into an extreme action to generate media coverage. It was, in other words, an attempt to reframe the entire case as a manufactured crisis. Marcus called it a Hail Mary with structural problems. He was calm. I was not. I was angry, not the cold, focused anger of someone building a case. This was the hot, immediate anger of someone being told that the night her daughter's lips turned blue was a calculated performance. I sat with that anger for about an hour. Then I made myself a cup of tea, opened my laptop, and wrote out every reason Carol Denning's claim was demonstrably false. Marcus had advised me to document and not provoke. The gas shutoff had happened in the context of a polar vortex declared emergency. The TRO filing had been prepared in real-time response. Gerald Park had been in contact with me the same night. Deshawn had been at the valve site. None of it, not one detail, aligned with a setup. I sent the list to Marcus. He said, "This is exactly what I needed to take apart her timeline." Marcus filed a motion in the civil case to depose Carol Denning prior to trial. Simultaneously, Janet Hollis, still representing Kwame, moved to have Carol's statement entered as exhibit evidence of potential witness tampering, given the timing. The AG's office opened a separate line of inquiry into whether Carol's offer of testimony had been solicited by Diane personally after the criminal complaint had been filed, which, if true, would constitute witness interference. August was going to be busy. On July 19th, Cedarwood held its annual summer block party, a tradition that had, according to Tom, become increasingly hollow in recent years, with Diane managing the guest list and vendor approvals with the same energy she brought to the mailbox cluster marigolds. This year, Francis Wu organized it. The new management company handled permits. It was held in the common area park at the center of Cedarwood, and it ran from 4 p.m. until well past dark. I brought a fruit salad. My mother wore a yellow sundress and sat in a folding chair and received neighbors like a queen receiving visitors. Maya ate 3 hot dogs and caught fireflies in a jar and released them at dusk. Tom told stories that made everyone laugh. I was talking to Sophia Reyes near the lemonade table when she said, quietly, without looking at me, "She's still in the neighborhood, you know? She hasn't moved." I had known this abstractly but hadn't thought about it concretely. Diane lived 2 streets away. She had driven past my house and I had driven past hers every day since January. We had not spoken since before the January hearing. I said, "I know." Sophia said, "She came to the block party last year and handed out laminated copies of the noise ordinance." I said, "What did she hand out this year?" Sophia said, "Nothing. She didn't come. We watched Maya chase fireflies across the grass." "That's progress," I said. Carol Denning's deposition was scheduled for August 12th. In the weeks before it, Marcus's investigator found something interesting. Carol Denning had left Diane's employ under circumstances that were, according to 2 former Cedarwood board members, contentious. She had allegedly been denied severance after 4 years of service. Marcus subpoenaed Carol's personal financial records as part of the deposition preparation. He found that Carol had received a wire transfer of $15,000 to her personal account on July 10th, 1 day before she contacted Diane's criminal attorney. The wire had originated from an LLC registered in Delaware with no declared operating activity. A shell. Marcus brought this to the AG's office immediately. Sandra Kolb, the investigator who had interviewed me in February, called the next day. She confirmed that the AG was now treating the Carol Denning testimony as a coordinated effort to suborn perjury. The criminal case against Diane had just gained a new chapter. Marcus called me with the update and then said, "I need to ask you something. You've been at this for 8 months. Are you still in? Because what we're about to walk into is not the end of the fight. It might be the beginning of the hardest part." I said, "She tried to freeze my family. Then she tried to destroy my business. Then she tried to call my attorney a liar. I'm in until it's over." He said, "Good. Then let's end it." August was sweltering and relentless. Carol Denning arrived at her deposition in Marcus's conference room on August 12th. A thin woman in her 50s with careful posture and the specific energy of someone performing composure. Marcus was patient, meticulous, and merciless. He began with Carol's timeline, where she'd been, who she'd spoken to, what documents she'd seen. He established, methodically, that her claimed memory of overhearing Marcus and me discussing a setup strategy was physically impossible. The conversation she described had allegedly taken place in Marcus's office on October 15th. Marcus had travel records and an assistant's calendar showing he had been in Cincinnati on October 15th for an unrelated case. The conversation could not have happened. Carol held her story. Then Marcus presented the wire transfer. Carol's composure disintegrated. She asked to speak to her attorney privately. The deposition recessed for 40 minutes. When she returned, Carol invoked her Fifth Amendment right against self-incrimination for the next 27 questions. The AG's office issued a subpoena to Carol Denning 4 days after the deposition. A forensic accounting team was tracking the Delaware LLC backward through 2 more layers of entity. Marcus said it would eventually lead somewhere specific. Diane's criminal attorneys filed a motion to have the perjury investigation bifurcated from the main criminal case. The judge denied it. The tent was even bigger now, and August had 3 more weeks to go. Diane made one more move in August. It was the boldest and, in retrospect, the most desperate. On August 21st, she filed a defamation lawsuit against me personally, alleging that statements I had made to Evelyn Torres of the Columbus Dispatch, specifically my characterization of the gas shutoff as deliberate endangerment, were knowingly false and had caused her reputational and professional harm. The lawsuit asked for $400,000 in damages. Marcus called me as soon as he received the filing. His voice was professionally steady, but underneath it I could hear something that in anyone else I would have called outrage. He said, "This is called a slap suit strategic lawsuit against public participation. It is designed entirely to cost you money and time and frighten you into silence. Ohio has an anti-slap statute. I'm filing a motion to dismiss under that statute by end of week, and I am going to ask the court for full attorney's fees and sanctions against her attorneys for filing a frivolous action." He paused. "How are you doing?" I said, "Filing a lawsuit against me for telling the truth about the night she froze my child is the most Diane thing Diane has ever done." He said, "Yes, and we're going to make her regret it." The anti-slap motion was filed August 26th. Marcus's brief was 29 pages and methodically documented that every statement I had made to the Dispatch was either factually supported by documentary evidence, B, confirmed by independent witnesses, or C, a constitutionally protected expression of personal experience. He included the Franklin County Court's own TRO order, a judicial finding that the gas shutoff had occurred. He included the AG's criminal complaint, a state finding of probable cause that the shutoff constituted criminal endangerment. Her own lawsuit, he argued, confirmed that my characterization was not only accurate but understated. Marcus asked for $75,000 in sanctions against Whitfield and Grove, who had, despite everything, filed this one. I did not know until later that Marcus had called the managing partner of Whitfield and Grove directly after filing the motion. He told me about it casually. I told them if they filed anything else on her behalf, I would seek sanctions every single time, and their professional reputation would not survive this case. He paused. I was very polite about it. I believed him. September arrived. The slap motion was heard September 9th. The judge, not Judge Marsh, a different judge handling the new filing, took 40 minutes to dismiss the defamation suit in full, granted $52,000 in sanctions to Marcus's firm, and issued a written opinion describing the suit as precisely the type of meritless litigation that the anti-slap statute was enacted to prevent. The opinion was published online. Evelyn Torres wrote a 4th article. By this point, the Cedarwood Estates case had been cited in 3 law school HOA law seminars and referenced in a proposed state bill strengthening anti-slap protections. The tent had become a circus tent and then a stadium. Diane's Cincinnati civil attorneys filed for withdrawal from representation on September 15. Court records, public, showed their motion cited irreconcilable differences over case strategy. Diane was now, in the civil matter, effectively unrepresented. She filed a pro-se motion to continue the October trial, requesting more time to find new counsel. Marcus did not oppose the continuation as long as the conditions of the case freeze remained in effect. Judge Marsh granted a 60-day continuation. New trial date, December 8th. Marcus said, December 8th. The way he said it carried weight, like a date circled on a calendar, like a destination finally becoming visible. I bought the bottle of wine Priya's husband had sent and put it on the kitchen table. I called Tom and said, "Come over for dinner this weekend. Bring Carol." He said, "Something to celebrate?" I said, "Practice celebrating. The real one is coming." He said, "I'll bring the good glasses." On Friday night, Tom and Carol came for dinner and we ate and drank, and my mother told a story about her life in Accra before she came to America that she had not told in years. A story about her own mother, my grandmother, who had once walked 40 minutes each way to deliver a letter to an official who was treating her neighborhood unfairly. She dressed up, my mother said. She wore her best dress and her church shoes. She said, "If you are going to fight for something true, you look the part." She looked at me when she said it. I said, "I wore good shoes to every court date." My mother smiled. "I noticed," she said. In October, something happened that I hadn't expected to happen. Diane lost her home. She hadn't sold it. The court had issued a preliminary asset freeze in connection with both the civil and criminal cases, and the real financial picture had begun to emerge in discovery. The forensic accountant's full report, which came out in October, showed that Diane had remortgaged her Cedarwood home in 2021 to fund what the report described as personal expenditures inconsistent with her declared income. She had been operating at a loss for years. The Pinnacle arrangement had been keeping her afloat. Without it, the structure collapsed. She defaulted on the mortgage in September. By October, the home was in foreclosure. Cedarwood's most relentless standards enforcer was losing her house in the neighborhood she had controlled for 6 years. I did not feel triumphant about Diane's foreclosure. I felt complicated. She had hurt people systematically and deliberately, and the consequences were real and just. But foreclosure is its own form of devastation, and I am not someone who takes pleasure in devastation. I thought about her daughter Renata calling me from Cincinnati to apologize. I thought about the world Diane had built, the control, the lanyard, the laminated agendas, the gavel, and how all of it had been built on a fear so foundational she had probably stopped seeing it years ago. I didn't forgive her, but I acknowledged the human wreckage of her own making. Then I moved on. November came. Trial in the civil case was December 8th. Marcus received word in early November that Diane had found new civil representation, a solo practitioner from Dayton who, according to Marcus's discreet inquiries, was known for taking long-shot cases on contingency. "She's betting the attorney on a win," Marcus said, "which tells me she has no money to pay up front." He said it neutrally. I said, "Does it change anything?" He said, "It tells me she's going to try something dramatic at trial. When you have nothing to lose, you swing for the fence." He said it with the tone of someone who has seen people swing for fences and knows what usually happens next. The week before trial, in late November, I got a call from Evelyn Torres. She said, "I have something I want to run by you before I publish. I've confirmed, through separate sources, that the Delaware LLC that wired money to Carol Denning traces back to a joint account between Diane Holbrook and her ex-husband, a man named Robert Fitch, who currently lives in Scottsdale, Arizona. Robert Fitch was, before his retirement, a financial advisor. He appears to have structured the LLC to make the payment untraceable. He's now a subject of the AG's investigation. I said, Evelyn, you've been covering this case for 10 months. How does it feel to find that? She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, it feels like the kind of story you don't see coming even when you're looking. I said, that's how it feels from here too. Trial was 9 days away. Marcus and I met for 2 hours on December 1st to walk through the case structure one last time. He said the defense's only remaining viable strategy was to argue that Diane had been acting on legal advice, that she'd been told the bylaw clause authorized the utility action, and to limit damages by arguing she had limited financial resources. Against this, we had the criminal complaint, the forensic audit, the Lech cooperation, the Gerald emails, the Deschamps engineering report, the judge's TRO language, 3 board member affidavits, the Carol Denning deposition breakdown, the slap dismissal, and 10 months of documented retaliation. Marcus said, she has very little road left. I said, let's make sure the last of it runs out in that courtroom. December 8th was a Monday. Cold, overcast, the particular gray of central Ohio in winter. Not threatening, just permanent. I wore my good shoes and a dark blazer and drove to the courthouse alone. Marcus met me in the lobby with coffee. He said, how are you? I said, ready. He said, good, because I don't think this lasts more than 2 days. I didn't ask why. I was about to find out. Diane's new attorney, a man named Carl Bauer from Dayton, opened with a statement that surprised everyone in the courtroom, including, I believe, Marcus. He said that his client acknowledged certain procedural irregularities in her management of the HOA and deeply regretted the impact of the utility action on the Osei family. He said she was prepared to make a significant settlement offer on the first day of trial, avoiding the burden and expense of full proceedings. Judge Marsh looked at Marcus. Marcus looked at me. I had told him what I wanted from a settlement. He stood up and said, Your Honor, we'd like to hear the offer. The offer Diane's attorney presented was a check for $180,000 in compensatory and punitive damages, payable to Rachel Osei personally, a written public apology to be published in the Columbus Dispatch, a voluntary 5-year ban on serving in any HOA leadership capacity in the state of Ohio, and a contribution of $40,000 to a Cedarwood Estates Community Recovery Fund. It was, I will acknowledge, a significant offer, more than I had expected, less than what the case was worth, but close enough that Marcus and I had privately agreed it was within the range of acceptance. The 2 conditions that mattered most to me were in it, the public apology and the ban. Your Honor, Marcus said, the plaintiff accepts. The courtroom was very quiet for a moment. Bauer looked at Diane. Diane looked at the table. Judge Marsh looked at both parties and said she would have the settlement agreement reviewed and signed before end of day. She then said, I want to note for the record that this settlement does not resolve the pending criminal matters, which remain on their own trajectory. The AG's office will proceed according to its own timeline. She looked at Diane directly. Ms. Holbrook, you've had an opportunity today to take responsibility in a civil forum. I hope you understand that accountability in the criminal forum is not optional. Diane said nothing. Her attorney said, Understood, Your Honor. I signed the settlement agreement at 2:47 p.m. Marcus signed as counsel. Bauer signed. Diane signed last. I watched her hand move across the paper. The same hand that had held the gavel. The same hand that had mailed 14 violation notices. The same hand that had, somehow, thought it could extinguish us with a valve and a polar vortex. She signed. It was done. I walked out of the Franklin County Courthouse at 3:15 p.m. into the cold gray afternoon. Marcus walked beside me. He said, You know that this was one of the better HOA cases I've seen in terms of the outcome. Most of them don't end this cleanly. I said, It's not clean. The criminal case is still going. The audit money is still being sorted. 41 families are still processing what happened to their community. He said, but they're processing it in a community that has a functioning board, honest management, and a homeowner rights amendment. That's not nothing. I said, no, it's not nothing. The public apology from Diane Holbrook ran in the Columbus Dispatch on December 15th. It was short. Marcus and Bauer had agreed on the language together. It said, I want to sincerely apologize to Rachel Osei, her daughter, and her mother for the harm caused by actions taken during my tenure as HOA president. The decision to interrupt utility service to their home was wrong. The financial management of association funds through Pinnacle Property Solutions involved conflicts of interest that I should have disclosed. I am sorry for the breach of trust this has caused to the Cedarwood Estates community. It did not say everything, but it said the things that needed to be in print. Evelyn Torres published it alongside a news article. The article noted that Diane was awaiting trial in the criminal matter. I read both and then closed my laptop. The $40,000 community fund was established at Cedarwood Estates in January. Francis Wu administered it. It was used to reimburse 3 families who had paid professional fees fighting HOA violations during Diane's tenure, to cover repairs on the Garcias wheelchair ramp, which the HOA had forced them to remove, and to fund a new community garden at the common area park, which Maya and her friend Lucy helped plant in the spring. The chickadees found it within a week. My mother photographed them. January of the following year, 13 months after the night in -15. Diane Holbrook stood in Franklin County Common Pleas Court and entered a plea agreement with the AG's office. She pleaded guilty to 1 count of theft in office and 1 count of reckless endangerment. A reduced charge from criminal endangerment, negotiated on the basis of her civil settlement and cooperation with the financial investigation. The 3rd charge, telecommunications harassment, was dropped as part of the agreement. The plea carried a sentence of 3 years of supervised probation, 200 hours of community service, full restitution of the forensic auditors calculated. Misappropriated funds, $289,400, to be paid over 3 years, and a permanent ban from serving in any fiduciary HOA or community leadership role in Ohio. Robert Fitch, Diane's ex-husband in Scottsdale, was charged separately in Arizona with conspiracy related to the wire transfer to Carol Denning. He entered his own plea agreement in February. Carol Denning, who had cooperated with the AG after the deposition, received immunity from prosecution in exchange for full testimony. Howard Lech paid his share of the forensic restitution, sold his interest in Pinnacle to a property management company in Cleveland, and, last I heard, was managing a small rental portfolio in a Columbus suburb. He sent me a letter. I didn't respond. Some things don't require a response. Spring came to Cedarwood Estates the way it comes everywhere, gradually, then all at once. By March, the new Nguyen's, the family that had moved into the house the original Nguyen's left, had learned the names of every family on their block, and their toddler had befriended Maya over a shared interest in sidewalk chalk. The community garden had 12 plots and a waiting list. The April board meeting had 22 attendees, the most in peacetime history, according to Tom, who kept such statistics in his head. I finished the last of Marcus's invoice in February and added up the total cost of the fight. Attorney fees, the engineer's time, the emergency hotel night, the bank compliance disruption, the business slowdown. The number was $38,400. Against that, the $180,000 settlement, plus the Lech compensatory payment, plus the assessment refund. The math was not the point, but the math was not bad. More importantly, the math was honest. Every dollar accounted for, every receipt saved, every binder page dated. In March, I was invited to speak at a Columbus Bar Association seminar on HOA law reform. I almost said no. Then I thought of the Garcias wheelchair ramp. Penguins basketball hoop. The 19 enforcement actions out of 22 targeting homeowners of color. I said yes. I spoke for 25 minutes with notes I'd prepared in the kitchen at 5 a.m. The room was full of attorneys. They listened. 2 of them approached me afterward and said they were working on the state anti-SLAPP bill and wanted to include Osei versus Holbrook as a named precedent in the legislative record. I said yes to that too. Marcus sent me a bottle of wine in April with a card that said, "You were the best documented client I've ever had. The binder deserves its own bar admission." I put the bottle next to the one from Priya's husband that I still hadn't opened. Then I opened both of them and invited everyone over. Tom and Carol, Kwame and his wife, Sophia Reyes, who had started law school in September. She told me she was considering HOA law. Deshaun and his wife, Gerald Park, who brought cookies his wife had made. Francis Wu, who was already 4 months into a remarkably competent HOA presidency. Janet Hollis, who had driven from the other side of the county. And Priya, who had found the pinnacle connection in the first place and never charged me for the extra work. My mother sat at the center of the room that evening, as she always does without trying. She told the story about her own mother again, the good dress, the church shoes, the letter to the official. This time she told the ending, which she hadn't told before. The official had read the letter and done nothing. So my grandmother had gone back every week for 3 months, always in her good dress, always polite, always carrying a new letter with new documentation, until the official's secretary finally told him that the woman wasn't going to stop coming. The official relented. She outlasted him, my mother said. She was too organized and too patient and too right. He had nowhere left to run. The room was quiet. Tom said, "That sounds familiar." My mother looked at me. "It is," she said. "It runs in the family." A year after the settlement, I drove past Diane's house on Willow Creek Drive. It had been sold in March of the prior year, new owners. A couple with a teenage daughter who had already, according to Tom, committed the minor HOA infraction of leaving their car in the driveway for 3 consecutive weeks while it was being repaired. The new board sent them a friendly reminder. They moved the car. That was the end of it. The fountain was gone. The terracotta door had been repainted in one of the 42 approved colors. On a Tuesday morning in April, a morning exactly 2 years after the Dispatch ran its first article about us, I sat in my kitchen with good coffee and the sound of house finches outside at Maya's feeder. My mother was in the next room. Maya was at school. The chickadees had returned. The binder was in my filing cabinet, organized and complete. Not because I needed it anymore, but because it was a record of what had been done and what had been done in response, and what had happened to the truth when someone tried to silence it with a gas valve in a polar vortex. I am Rachel Osei, licensed electrician, business owner, mother, daughter. I moved to Cedarwood Estates 18 months before any of this happened because the house had a walk-in shower on the ground floor and a yard big enough for fireflies. I did not move there to fight. I did not move there to become a precedent in a legislative record or a subject of a law school seminar or the reason that an HOA president's name is now permanently attached to the phrase "what not to do." I moved there to live. And I do. My grandmother walked in her good dress to deliver a letter to an official who didn't want to listen. She went back every week for 3 months. She was too organized and too patient and too right. I know something about that. My mother taught it to me without saying it out loud, by example, the way the most important lessons arrive. I organized. I was patient. I was right. And when someone tried to take the warmth from my family in the coldest night of the year, I made sure that the consequences traveled in the direction they were supposed to travel, toward the person who had caused them. Maya still keeps her bird notebook. House finches, chickadees, a downy woodpecker who showed up in November and stayed. She has 43 species documented, each one hand-drawn and dated. Last spring. She added a common sparrow and noted in her careful 6-year-old handwriting beside it. Very ordinary. Very important. I framed that page. It's on my office wall, between my electrician's license and a photo of my mother as a young woman in a craw. It is the best summary of this entire story I know how to give. The anti-SLAPP bill passed the Ohio legislature in the fall. Governor's signature in November. Marcus called me when it happened. He said, "The OSE precedent is in the legislative record." I said, "Good." He said, "How do you feel?" I said, "Like an electrician who traced a circuit back to its source and fixed the fault." He said, "That's a very good way to feel." He was right. Cedarwood Estates held its second annual post-Iron block party in July. The new management company handled permits. Francis Wu organized logistics. Someone brought a sound system. Someone else brought a taco truck. My mother wore her yellow sundress again. Maya and Lucy won the three-legged race. Tom gave a toast that lasted 4 minutes and ended with, "To Cedarwood. May our only disputes from here forward be about which flavor of lemonade." Everyone cheered. Gerald Park, standing next to me, said quietly, "I've been waiting 11 years for a night like this." I handed him a cup of lemonade. He said, "Pink or yellow?" I said, "Your choice." He took the pink. I took the yellow. We were both right.